With this segment, we're going to look at what happens when you have a child that you want to learn the multiplication tables, and they are very active in sports, and they do not want to sit around and try to learn it. So sometimes you will, let's say, get a computer program that if they get it right, then they get a little person that jumps up and says, "You got it right." But you find out very quickly after you get that before they've finished playing it the first time, they figure out how to get around the game. And what they do is they will punch remind me several times or whatever until they have the answer. And then, okay, they've got that, and they go on. But they haven't learned it. So what we want to do is to teach our child hard facts the easy way, so that after a few years, they still know the facts. After many years, they will still know the facts. So how do you do this? Well, we do use games, but we don't use computer games. And some of these games you've never heard of, and in other games, you've heard of them before, but you haven't perhaps thought of using them as a method of teaching. So let's go to the child that I'm going to look at, and this child loves basketball. Do you stay indoors and ask him questions and try to get him to learn correctly, or do you take him outdoors and hand him a basketball and say, every time you get a question right, you get to shoot a hoop? And if you get the question wrong, I get a point. If you make your hoop, you get a point. But if you get it wrong, it's just I get a point. And if you happen to be really good in basketball, then just go ahead and play a game of horse or something. But for those of us who couldn't hit the hoop if we tried, that's the rules. Because the word games denotes fun instead of work, many parents and teachers won't try using games to help their children learn. Yet the benefit of using games to help teach becomes apparent immediately, if used properly. If you've tried games and are disappointed, you're probably not using a question box, or you're not using it right, or you're failing to use game rules to ensure discipline. So games fulfill the need for motivation, repetition, discipline, and reward, while enabling a child to remember facts that he or she would otherwise consider too dull or too hard to recall. The amount of material learned and retained by students with the regular use of games will surprise and delight you. Games catch the wandering attention of the poorer student, and it motivates them to learn. Class time passes swiftly, and usually your students, especially if you're playing a game, they don't want to quit. Teachers using games have had their students beg them to continue long after the bell is rung. They've also discovered that their students can handle more difficult material since students pay attention to the information when they know a game is going to follow. So how do you use teaching games? To use a teaching game properly, you need to observe a few rules. Always have your questions prepared in advance. Write down at the beginning of the series of lessons a list of facts and attitudes that you want your class to learn. This will also help you teach, for you will have a clear idea of where you are going. Next, write these out in question form on separate slips of 1 by 3 inch paper, or larger if you need it. 1 question per slip of paper. Under each question, write down the answer that you expect to hear. This helps keep you consistent, and if you have other children, they can play the game with each other because they will stand here with the question in their hand and ask the question, and the other student, maybe the first student is in math and the other student is in English. So the other student is asking the first student math questions, and this person is asking the other one English questions. So if you have the answers written down, they know if they've answered right. And this works also very well because if you have a large age range, as long as the one child can read the answers, they're fine. Or if they aren't quite sure, the other child can look and check, yep, I got the answer right. Sometimes 2 or 3 questions are needed to cover a point, and in that case, you need to keep the questions together somehow. So you can have them stapled together or whatever. On the back of each slip, you might want to write the number of the lesson when the question was first introduced. Use the ones marked number 1 for the first lesson, number 2 for the second lesson, etc. As the lessons progress, children will begin to know the answers to lesson 1 so well that you can set them aside. And then after a while, they know all the answers on lesson 2. You can set them aside into a different question box, which is the box that you will use for a review at the end of the quarter or at the end of the teaching unit. Always use a question box. Now I cover how to ask a question, how to think up a question, how to write a question so that it teaches in the question segment. And also I describe the question boxes to you. So if you haven't covered that yet, please go back and do so. During the first 2 to 4 lessons, have short 5-minute review games, such as the basketball game, since you won't have many questions. Now, how do games provide repetition? You leave the questions in the box to be used in the following games. By the time you're hitting the 10th lesson, the 12th lessons, you're going to play longer games. And at the end of the series, the lessons are short and the games are long. But what happens is the children are becoming so well knowing some of these questions that they can answer the question before you even read it completely. In that case, try asking the question in a different way to see if they really know the fact. And then, as I've said before, set those questions aside. Leave the questions with the unit so that it can be used as a final review. Now, I mentioned basketball at the very beginning. Right now, I'm just doing the how to teach using a game. But when I go to the rules of the game, which is in the next segment, then I will tell you the rules for basketball. Games must be run orderly and with a teaching purpose. So like a good referee, keep control of the game. Establish rules before the game begins. If you've got several students, the rule is only the one answering the question may talk, no one else. Or there may be no remarks made about the answer by the other students, such as, "Oh, I knew that," or "That was easy." Both sentences are implying that the person answering the question should have known it. So the very first time a rule is broken, award a penalty. Take away a point from that team or from that person. Or if you're having a game such as the football, hockey, or soccer, you can do a 5-yard penalty, which can be given against the team with the unruly member. Once this penalty is given, the child's own teammates will be quick to keep him in order. And if it's not a team, he just doesn't like losing points because he wasn't playing correctly, and he will straighten himself up. This is how a game provides discipline to your class. You will seldom have to award penalties if you avoid making the mistake of giving warnings instead of penalties. You don't give warning. In baseball, if it comes across the plate and the batter misses it, it's a strike. If the ball is wide, it's not a strike, it's a ball. And when the umpire says what it is, there's no arguing. So if you are the referee or the umpire for these games, you're asking the questions, you're running the game, do not give warnings. Give penalties if they need it because of discipline. Don't fall into the trap of giving warnings. I've seen too many teachers, oh, that was such a little thing. No, discipline. And the interesting thing about discipline is if you do it for things that are small, you don't have to do it for things that are big because they never get there. So how do you ask a question so that it helps teach the lesson? It's done in this manner. A question is asked. If the correct answer is given, it is rewarded by the player advancing in the game. If the incorrect answer is given, the sides or players change, a turn is lost, or the player just does not get the point. But the teacher gives the correct answer. This is extremely important, and this is how you teach with games. The class, the student, your child, must hear the correct answer immediately instead of several wrong answers. You do not ask one student a question, and if he says the wrong answer, go to the next student. If he says the wrong answer, go to the next student. If he says it, because the children are hearing the wrong answers. You ask a question, you get a wrong answer, you say the right answer, and then go on. But do not leave the wrong answer hanging out there in the air. You have to have it given immediately. This is the way you use the game as a teaching tool. One of the advantages of a game, let's say that you have some information facts that you want to teach the kids, but it's just really, really difficult to understand. So you might write out 3 or 4 questions that will explain, one, this question, and knowing the answer to that goes to the next one, knowing the answer to that, and leads up to this difficult concept that you're trying to teach. Because they're in a game situation, they tune in, they listen, they pay attention, especially when you're using the question box right, because after you ask the questions, they go back into the box. And then with the next child or the next one, that question is being pulled out again and it's being asked again. Remember, you're using the game as a teaching tool, even while you're quizzing them to see what they know. So remember, if you haven't done so, check out the segment on asking questions, writing questions, and that includes the question box. Make sure that you don't have too many questions in your question box. Ask the same questions several times during the course of the game. You do that by putting the questions back in the box after you've asked them. You do not set them aside. So let's say I ask Johnny, what is 9 times 4? And he says 20. And you say 9 times 4 is 36. The question goes back into the box. Let's say you say, what's 9 times 5? And he says 45. You say, that's right. The question goes back in the box. Because the questions are put back in the box, they know that there's a big chance that they can be asked it again. Sometimes you put the question back in the box, you shuffle things around, you pull the question out, you've got the same question. Ask it. They need to know that that will happen. That is how to use your question box properly, and it teaches the class to listen to the answers given by the teacher. Say, if he didn't know what 9 times 4 is, he knows that question's going to go back in the box. He's going to remember your answer. Or if there's 2 or 3 children doing this, they're going to remember the answers. A listening class is a learning class, and this is one way to teach your class to listen. Another thing that this does is it calls the attention of the entire class. Say you've got several kids, you're teaching them the same thing. It calls the attention of the entire class to the things being taught during the lesson and the game. Students realize they must know the lesson to play the game. This is another way that teaching games help you. And asking the same question several times during the course of the game lets the children hear the correct teaching several times and requires several students, if you've got them, to respond to the same question at different times. You may ask your advanced student a hard question, and several times until all the class has heard both it and the answer. Then, when you ask the students who might be struggling that question, if they've been listening, which they should because of the game situation, they will know the answer. And this is how you improve the abilities of your poorer students with games. One of the things with games is that you can play the game with, well, I've played it where I was teaching teachers how to teach, but I think I had probably 200 people in the class at that time. And we played a game so that they could see how the game was played. I just split the class down the middle, and this side had, they had to call out the answer, and this side had to call out their answer. And you can play it like that. Or you can play it with 2 children or just 1. When you're playing with 1 child, you are the other person playing. And when I was describing the basketball game and talking about playing horse, if you have 2 students, then yes, they can be playing horse. If you have just you and your student, then you can do the game, but they can shoot all the baskets. The games that can only be played with more than 1, where you have to have a group, I've marked it with a G. But the games that aren't marked, at the very end of the game itself, I have put in italics just any changes that you need to make it so that you can play it with just 1 child.